Some men earn respect by demanding it. They walk into rooms loud. They introduce themselves early. They make sure you know their resume before you had time to form an opinion. They fill silences the way water fills a container. Completely, immediately, without any particular awareness of what they're displacing. I have never been that kind of man. I don't say that with pride, exactly, and I don't say it with regret. It is simply a fact about me. The way it is a fact that I take my coffee black, that I have driven a truck with a broken passenger side heater for 6 years without fixing it, and that I have been underestimated in one form or another by men who wore their confidence louder than their competence for the better part of 4 decades. I did not spend those decades waiting for a moment to prove them wrong. That is not how I am built. I spent them doing the work, making the decisions, building the structures that patient men build when nobody is watching them closely enough to notice. My name is Gerald Marsh. I am 67 years old. I live outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a house my wife Diane and I have owned since 1993, on a half-acre lot with a detached garage that I have filled over 30 years with the organized accumulation of man who fixes things rather than replacing them. I grew up about 9 miles from where I live now. I have lived my entire adult life in more or less the same 10-mile radius, which my father-in-law once described at Thanksgiving dinner as a failure of ambition. He said it with the specific warmth of a man who believes he is being generous by noticing you at all. I smiled. I have been smiling at men like my father-in-law for 67 years. It is, without question, my most practiced skill. I want to tell you something about what I actually did for a living, because it matters to the story in a way that will become clear, and because the people in my family, particularly on Diane's side, never bothered to find out. I spent 41 years as a government contractor, specifically in procurement and supply chain management. I manage a movement of industrial components, materials, and fabricated parts from supplier networks to federal project sites across the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest. It is not a glamorous field. There are no good stories about it at dinner parties. When people ask what you do and you say supply chain procurement for federal construction contracts, their eyes go to a particular middle distance, and they nod in the way people nod when they're already composing their follow-up question for someone else. I learned early in my career not to take this personally. The work was not interesting to look at from the outside. From the inside, it was the most precise education a man could receive in how things actually connect, how a single supplier relationship, cultivated or neglected, could determine whether a project ran on time or ran aground, whether a contract was won or lost, whether the name on the paperwork meant something or didn't. I learned, over 41 years, that the quietest man in any negotiation is almost always the one who walks out with the better terms. I learned that the people who dismiss you in a room are, without exception, the easiest people to work around, because they have already told you everything about where their blind spots are. And I learned, through decades of working with supplier networks, that most people in my world never thought about twice, that the companies no one looks at directly, the mid-sized, unglamorous, deeply embedded suppliers that keep larger operations running, are the most durable investments a careful man can make. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My father-in-law's name is Raymond Cutler. He ran a sheet metal fabrication business called Cutler Metal Works out of a facility on the east side of Columbus. He incorporated in 1989, the same spring Diane and I got married, and he built the company over 31 years to a peak of about 80 employees, 2 facilities, and a client list that covered commercial construction, HVAC manufacturing, and light industrial work across central Ohio. Raymond was, by the measures that Raymond considered important, a successful man. He had built something with his hands and his will and his specific brand of unrelenting forward motion, and I respected that. I respected it genuinely, without any of the condescension that can live inside respect when respect is offered by a man who believes he has something to prove. I respected it the way you respect a well-made tool. It does exactly what it was designed to do. It holds its edge, and you don't need to love it to recognize its value. The problem was that Raymond's self-regard had a structural requirement. In order for Raymond to occupy the size he believed himself to be, the men around him had to be somewhat smaller. His son-in-law, meaning me, was a particular convenience in this arrangement. I was quiet. I drove an old truck. I had spent 4 decades in a field nobody found interesting. I had not built anything Raymond could drive past on the highway and point at. I was, in Raymond's estimation, a man who had maintained rather than created, who had administered rather than built, who had, through some combination of limitation and lack of vision, settled for the life available to him rather than constructing the life a real man constructs. He never said any of this directly. Raymond was not a direct man, despite his bluster. What he did was say things adjacent to it, consistently, over 3 decades, in a particular tone of a man who believes his observations are objective. He said, at a graduation dinner in the spring of 2004, that the difference between men who moved industries and men who served them was simply a matter of appetite. He said, at a Christmas gathering in 2011, that government work was a fine safety net for men who needed the structure. He noted my 04F 150 at enough family gatherings, with enough of that particular smile, that the truck became a kind of shorthand in the room, a physical argument for his position. Sitting in the driveway, rust beginning at the wheel wells, the passenger window that sticks when it's below 40 degrees. Diane absorbed all of this with the specific patience of a woman who has loved 2 difficult men at the same time for 30 years. Her father and the husband her father underestimated, and who has built between them a life that required her to be fluent in both. She had a phrase for her father. She called him a man who needed an audience. She was not wrong. She also loved him, and I understood that love completely, even when I was the nearest prop in his performance. Our children, Patrick, born in 1991, and Claire, born in 1994, grew up understanding a particular weather system of family gatherings that included their grandfather. Patrick had learned, in adolescence, to read Raymond's regard as currency, which worried me. Claire had learned, earlier and more instinctively, to take it or leave it, which did not. By the time they were adults, both of them had arrived at a reasonable accommodation with their grandfather, respectful of what it built, clear-eyed about the rest, and I was grateful for that clarity in them, even though I understood it cost Claire something to develop it. I retired from government contracting in March of 2018 at 63 years old. My final project was a 14-month supply chain restructure for a mid-Atlantic defense installation, and when the final audit was signed off and the handoff documentation was complete, I drove home on a Friday afternoon in my F-150, pulled into the garage, and sat in the truck for about 4 minutes. Not from emotion, exactly, more from the specific quiet of a man who's been moving at a particular pace for 41 years and has just, for the first time, stopped. Then I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Diane and told her what I intended to do next. What I intended to do had been taking shape for the better part of 8 years. It had to do with the holding company, Marsh Capital Holdings, LLC, that my attorney, James Fowler Associates on Dublin Road, had helped me structure beginning in 2016. James is 61 years old, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who reads every word of every document twice before he lets you put a pen near it, and who has, in 22 years of working together, never once suggested I move faster than I was ready to move. The holding structure was clean, compliant, and effectively invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, which suited me exactly. I had, over the course of my career, accumulated resources that Raymond Cutler would have found surprising. This was not through any single dramatic event. It was through 41 years of a government contractor's salary, carefully managed, combined with a series of small, precise investments in the kinds of companies that my career had taught me to recognize: mid-size, embedded, unglamorous, essential, the fastener distributors, the precision tooling suppliers, the components manufacturers that sat 2 steps back from the names anyone had heard of and kept those names operational. I understood these companies the way a mechanic understands an engine. I knew which ones had good bones and poor succession planning. I knew which owners were 62 and tired and would take a fair offer from a patient buyer. I knew, from 41 years of watching supply chains function and fail, exactly where the leverage lived. The first acquisition under Marsh Capital was completed in the spring of 2018, a fastener distributor outside of Dayton. 11 employees, solid client base. The owner wanted out cleanly and I gave him a number that was fair by any measure. 16 months later, in August of 2019, I closed on a precision tooling supplier in Zanesville. 30-year relationship network, 12 employees, the kind of operation that had never needed to advertise because the work spoke entirely for itself. The third acquisition was completed on September 12, 2019, at James Follett's office at 2:47 in the afternoon. I signed the final documents for Harwick Industrial Supply, located in Newark, Ohio, 41 miles east of Columbus. Harwick was a sheet metal component supplier. They had been in operation since 1987. They had approximately 40 active client relationships across central Ohio's industrial and commercial construction sector. They had been Raymond Cutler's primary materials supplier for 19 consecutive years. I want to be precise about something here, because I think precision matters in a story like this. I did not acquire Harwick because of Raymond. I acquired Harwick because the deal made sense by every measure I applied to acquisitions. The margins were stable. The client relationships were anchored and long-tenured. The owner, Don Harwick, was 64 years old and had been quietly signaling for the better part of 18 months that he was ready to have a conversation. I had known Don peripherally through industry contacts going back to the mid-2000s. He was a straightforward man who had built something good and wanted to ensure it continued after him. I was a patient buyer with a clean structure and no interest in disrupting an operation that ran well. The fact that Raymond Cutler's company accounted for a meaningful portion of Harwick's annual revenue was a fact I noted. It was not the reason I made the call. But I will tell you honestly that when I sat in James Follett's office on September 12th and the last signature was done and James slid the folder across the desk, I let myself sit with that particular fact for a moment. The Harwick-Cutler relationship, 19 years. Raymond's primary supplier, my name on the paperwork. Something in me went very still. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something older than either of those, cold, clear, and absolute, like a long calculation arriving at its final line. Don Harwick stayed on as operations manager through a transition agreement that ran to the end of 2022. He was good at his work, and his people trusted him, and I had no interest in the disruption that comes from moving too fast. We spoke quarterly. Don ran the day-to-day. The ownership was a matter of public record, registered correctly, filed appropriately, but not a matter that came up in the ordinary course of business conversations. Most of Harwick's clients, including Cutler Metalworks, had no particular reason to review the ownership structure of a supplier they had been working with for 19 years without incident. Raymond, specifically, had no reason to look. Raymond had never looked at me closely enough to think I required looking for. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. The evening I want to tell you about was a Friday in February of 2020. Raymond's 73rd birthday dinner, held at his house in Worthington, a house he had bought in 1997 and renovated twice and referred to with the specific casualness of a man who wants you to know he owns something significant as a property. The gathering was a usual configuration. Diane's sister Carol and her husband Carl, Patrick and his wife Jenny, Claire and her boyfriend at the time, and Raymond at the head of the table in the way Raymond always occupied the head of a table, which was with both hands visible and a quality of settled authority over everything in the room, including the air. Dinner was good. Raymond was in good form, which meant he was at his most expansive, his most generous seeming, his most carefully performed version of a patriarch at ease. He talked about the business, a strong quarter, a new commercial client, an equipment upgrade he had been planning for 2 years and was finally executing. He talked about the industry. He talked about what it meant to build something that lasted, which was a subject he returned to with the regularity of a man who has found one theme that works and has decided it is sufficient. The conversation shifted, somewhere around 8:15, to contracts and vendor relationships. Carl had a situation with a subcontractor on a small construction project he was managing, a dispute about terms, a question about how to handle it. Raymond took the question the way Raymond took all questions at family dinners, which was as an invitation to demonstrate that he was the most qualified person in the room to answer it. He talked about vetting vendors. He talked about relationship-based business. He talked about what a name meant in an industry, the weight it carried, the history it represented, the way certain names opened doors, and others simply didn't. He had been talking for perhaps 6 minutes when he looked down the length of the table. Not directly at me. That was never how Raymond operated. He looked somewhere between me and the centerpiece, in the specific way of a man who is directing a remark at someone while maintaining the theatrical option of claiming he wasn't. "That's why I've always been careful," he said. "I don't put names on contracts that don't mean anything in this industry. You either have standing in a space or you don't. There is no middle ground on that. No offense to anybody." He smiled. The birthday dinner version of the smile, warm, generous, entirely self-satisfied. 3 people at the table laughed. The soft, reflexive laughter people who are not sure what they're laughing at but recognize that the man at the head of the table has made what he believes is a point. Carl nodded. Patrick looked at his plate. Jenny looked at me for exactly half a second and then looked away. Diane's hand found my knee under the table. She didn't squeeze it. She placed it flat and still, the way she has placed it for 31 years when we are in a room, and something has happened that she wants me to know she has seen. It is, in its own way, its own form of language, complete and sufficient and requiring no translation. I looked at Raymond. I held his gaze for a moment. The easy, unhurried gaze of a man who has nothing to hide and nothing to prove, which is in fact the most unsettling gaze available to a human being, though most people don't know that until they've been on the receiving end of it. "Makes sense," I said. That was the entirety of my response. 2 words, level, offered with the same pleasant neutrality I had been offering Raymond Cutler for 31 years. The words of a man who has heard you and found your argument insufficient of a rebuttal. Raymond moved on. The conversation moved with him. Dessert came. Cake was cut. By 9 o'clock we were in the living room, and Raymond was showing Carl something on his laptop about the equipment upgrade, and I sat in the chair nearest the window and drank a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold and watched the room with the specific detached patience of a man who knows something no one else in the room knows and has no particular urgency to change that. We left at 10:11. I drove home on I-270 in my 04 F-150, the heater on my side running the way it always runs, steady and reliable, and the cold gathering near the passenger door, the way it always gathers, and the Columbus skyline doing what the Columbus skyline always does at that hour, which is sit low and lit and entirely indifferent to particular weight of any given evening. I did not feel angry. I want to be accurate about this. What I felt was a specific quality of stillness, the stillness of a man standing at the edge of a long calculation that has already resolved itself, waiting only for the world to catch up. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The call came on a Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020, at 9:47 in the morning. I was in the garage working through a set of boxes I had been meaning to sort since the previous November, old project files, a set of hand tools that had belonged to my father, the accumulated archaeology of man who keeps things because he values continuity. My cell phone was on the workbench. The number that came up was a Columbus area code I placed after a moment as Harwick's main line. Don Harwick's voice, when I answered, had a particular quality that I recognized immediately as the voice of a man who has just delivered significant information to someone and is still holding the reverb of it. Careful, measured, choosing words with the precision of a man who understands that the next few sentences will matter. He said, "Gerald, I wanted to let you know I had a conversation this morning with Raymond Cutler. He called to discuss his spring contract renewal." I set down the tool roll I was holding. I leaned against the workbench. Don walked me through it. Raymond had called at 8:32 in the morning. Raymond was always in before 8, a fact he mentioned often, and had opened the conversation the way he always opened business conversations, which was with the easy authority of a man who believed himself to be the most significant party in any exchange. He had gone through the preliminary terms with Don, volume projections, pricing structures, delivery windows for the second quarter, standard renewal conversation, the kind they had apparently been having across 19 years and 3 previous contract cycles, without incident or surprise. Then Raymond had said something about continuity, about the value of long relationships, about how in 31 years he had built his business on knowing whose name was on the other side of an agreement, knowing the person knowing their word, knowing what they had built and what they stood for in industry. He had said, Don told me that this was the foundation of everything he had done. Personal relationships. Names that meant something. Don Harwick said he had let Raymond finish. He said there was a pause. Not his pause, but the natural pause at the end of a man's prepared remarks. The pause that expects either agreement or continuation. And into that pause, Don said he had told Raymond that Harwick Industrial Supply had been acquired in September of 2019, and that the acquiring entity was a holding company registered under the name of the current owner. He said, I told him the owner's name was Gerald T. Marsh. I stood in my garage in particular silence that follows the thing you have known was coming and still, when it arrives, carries its own specific weight. Don said, he asked me to repeat the name. I could picture it exactly. Raymond at his desk in the Cutler Metal Works office. The big desk, oak, that he had described to me once as the first real thing he had bought himself when the company started making real money. Raymond with his coffee and his legal pad and his 31 years of certainty. Raymond hearing Don Harwick say Gerald T. Marsh and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of floor that is not where he expected it to be. I repeated it. Don said, he thanked me for the information. Very composed. Professional. He ended the call. There was a brief pause on Don's end. Then he called back 6 minutes later and asked for your direct number. I told Don to give it to him. Then I thanked Don, ended the call, went inside the house, and poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where I have sat for 30 years when there was something to think through, and I put both hands around the mug, and I waited. The coffee was hot when I sat down. It was cold by the time the phone rang. Raymond called at 10:04 in the morning. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. His voice was the voice of a man performing composure over something that was not quite composed. Raymond Cutler had been performing versions of himself for 73 years, and he was good at it better than most, but there's a specific register that enters a voice when a person is reorganizing their understanding of a situation in real time, and I had spent 41 years in negotiations reading exactly that register, and I heard it clearly. He said my name. He said he had just gotten off the phone with Don Harwick over at Harwick Industrial. He said he hadn't realized. There was a pause there. The only pause Raymond took in the entire conversation, a pause of perhaps 2 full seconds. He hadn't realized that Harwick had changed ownership. I said that the acquisition had been completed a while back. He said, yes, apparently September. Don had mentioned. I said, September 12th. A silence. For seconds by my count. I counted because 4 seconds of silence from Raymond Cutler was, in 31 years, completely without precedent. Then he said, he supposed we should sit down at some point and discuss the contract terms for the coming year. I said that sounded entirely reasonable. I told him my attorney, James Follett. I gave him a name slowly. Clearly Follett & Associates, Dublin Road, would be in touch by Thursday with some preliminary paperwork, and we could set a meeting from there. He said, fine. Yes, that sounded fine. We ended the call at 10:11 in the morning. 7 minutes. I put the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then I drank the cold coffee. I have never been a man who needs things to be warm to appreciate them. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it is the truest thing in this story. I drove to the hardware store on Morse Road at 11:30 that morning because I needed a specific zinc-plated shelf bracket, 3-inch, heavy-duty, for a shelving unit I had been meaning to finish installing in the garage since October. The hardware store is 8 minutes from my house. I found the bracket on the third aisle, second shelf from the bottom. It was $7.42. The man at the register was about 22, wearing a store vest, and he said have a good one when I left, and I told him he too, and I meant it. I drove home, backed the F-150 into the garage, and installed the shelf. It took me until about 1:15 in the afternoon. When I was done, I stepped back and looked at it, and it was level and solid, and exactly where I needed it to be. That is what I did with the morning that Raymond Cutler found out my name was on his supplier's paperwork. James Follett sent the preliminary contract materials to Raymond's attorney, Steve Prentice of Prentice & Cole, on Thursday morning, March 5th, as I had said he would. The meeting was scheduled for March 11th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at James's office on Dublin Road. Raymond came with Steve Prentice. I came alone, which is a kind of decision that communicates something without requiring you to say it. James told me afterward that Raymond was composed throughout. The professional version of Raymond, which was a genuinely capable version, the version that had actually built something over 31 years. And I want to be clear that I never lost sight of that. The negotiation was straightforward. The terms James had prepared were fair. I had not engineered them to punish Raymond, because that had never been the point, and because I am not interested in running a business as an instrument of personal grievance. At one point, Steve Prentice asked whether there was any flexibility on the pricing structure for the coming year. James looked at the file for a moment. He is very good at that particular pause, James is, and said that the terms reflected the current market accurately. Raymond, Don told me later, accepted this without argument. Raymond signed a renewal at 3:47 in the afternoon. The terms were fair. The relationship continued. The business ran the way good businesses run, when the people operating them are competent and not distracted by the need to perform for each other. I told Diane the full story that evening. We were in the kitchen, and she was making the pasta with the braised short rib sauce that she has been making since 1993. And I came in and sat at the kitchen table and went through the whole thing in order, September 2019 to that morning. The way I tell things, in sequence, without embellishment beginning to end. She stopped stirring about halfway through and stood with the wooden spoon held still over the pot. And she listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you known this might happen?" I said I had known. It was possible since about October 2019. She thought about that. She turned back to the pot. Another silence. The thoughtful kind, the kind Diane takes when she is sorting through something with the care it deserves. "You didn't tell me," she said. Not an accusation. An observation. The way Diane makes observations. I said I hadn't wanted to put her between us. She stirred the pot. The kitchen smelled the way it has smelled on good evenings for 30 years. After a moment, she said, very quietly, "Gerald." Just my name. The way she says it when something is both exasperating and, in the final accounting, exactly right. I poured myself a glass of water. We ate dinner. We did not call Raymond. Easter 2020 was small. Pandemic restrictions. Immediate family only. A gathering that was quieter than usual in the way everything was quieter in those early months. Raymond came. And Raymond, with me, was different. Not transformed. Raymond Cutler was not a man built for transformation, and I would not have believed it if I had seen it. But the dismissal was gone. The specific practice performance of it. The smile, the adjacent remarks, the truck in the driveway as evidence, was simply absent. In its place was something I had not experienced from Raymond in 31 years of family gatherings, which was attention, genuine, recalibrated attention. He asked me about the Harwich operation. He asked about the Zanesville acquisition. He asked questions that contained inside them the tacit acknowledgement that the person being asked might actually know the answers. We talked for perhaps 25 minutes. It was more real conversation than we had managed across 3 decades. He did not apologize. I did not expect an apology, and I would not have known what to do with one. An apology from Raymond would have required him to name precisely what he had done, to inventory 31 years of it with the honest accounting it deserved, and that kind of precision of self-examination was not something Raymond had developed. I understood this. I had always understood this about him. What he gave me instead was accuracy, the specific accuracy of a man who has updated his understanding of who he is dealing with and is behaving accordingly. It was not friendship. It was not warmth. But it was honest, and honesty from Raymond Cutler, after 31 years of its absence, had a weight I did not expect. Raymond passed away in November of 2022 from a cardiac event. He was 75 years old. I drove to the hospital in the F, 1:50 on a Sunday evening, and I sat with Diane in the waiting room, and I felt, in that room, the particular plain grief that arrives when a long chapter closes, not the complicated grief of a man who has been wronged, not the relief of a man who has been freed, just a clean and simple weight of an ending. He was her father. He had built something real. He was not, in the final accounting, a villain. He was a man with a specific blind spot who spent 31 years looking directly away from a specific truth, and who spent the last 2 years of his life looking at it honestly. I do not know how to grade that. I am not sure it requires grading. Don Harwick retired in January of 2023. I promoted Sandra Pellegrino, who had been Don's operations lead for 11 years, to manage the facility. She is organized, precise, and entirely unimpressed by the idea that the job requires anything other than doing it well, which are exactly the qualities I look for. The Cutler Metal Works contract renews annually. Raymond's son Gary took over the business in early 2023 and handles the relationship directly. Gary is a straightforward man, methodical in the way his grandfather was not, and we get along well. He does not bring the history to the table, or if he knows it, he has the intelligence to understand it has no business being there. I still drive the 04F 150. The passenger heater is still broken. Diane mentions it once a year, around inspection time, in the tone she's been using about it since the heater first went in the winter of 2021. I tell her the engine is solid, and the rest of it does what it needs to do. She gives me the look. We go to dinner. There's a thing I've been trying to find the right words for, and I am not sure I am there yet. But it goes something like this. The man who dismisses you has already made a calculation. He has looked at what he can see of you, the truck, the job title, the quiet, the patience. And he has run his numbers, and he has arrived at an answer he is confident in. What he does not account for is the work that happens outside his field of vision, the decisions made at kitchen tables at 11 o'clock at night, the documents signed in attorneys' offices on September afternoons, the 19-year supplier relationships that were, as of a Tuesday morning in March, no longer quite what he thought they were. He had every opportunity to look. He chose, for 31 years, to decide instead. Some names mean everything in an industry. Some men just take a little longer to find out which names those are. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.